I'm Lindsay Smith with RealAgriculture. Joining me now is Angus Gidley-Baird. He's the animal protein analyst for Rabobank. Based in Australia, though, we're gonna talk Australia, which we don't get to talk to or about on Real Agriculture very much. Tell me a bit about what Australia has gone through on the cattle side, what you're talking about here at CattleCon.
Yeah, I think from an American point of view, it's interesting. Just we've been through a similar process in terms of a very dramatic liquidation of our cow herd, very low inventory levels, and then a recovery in the season and that rebuild of the herd. And we've worked our way through that rebuild now. That was 3 or 4 years ago. So reflecting on that and what we went through, what we saw in terms of impact those producers, ranchers, cow-calf, we call them producers, and sharing some of those insights to I suppose, stimulate some conversation amongst the US producers around what might happen when the rebuild starts.
So let's back up a bit. What prompted that liquidation? I know what's happening here in Canada, US, but what happened in Australia?
Yeah, it was mainly seasonal. We're very heavily reliant on the seasons. We're still producing, I think it's only something like 13 or 14% of our cattle are on feed in an overall inventory number. So we're still very heavily reliant on seasonal situations. So it was a couple of successive years of dry. We also had very high cattle inventories at the time. So the first round that we saw through 2013 to 2015 was effectively dry conditions and people selling down a lot of their excess females. Then we had a brief respite between 16, 17, 18 and 19 was dry again. 19 in some areas of Australia is considered to be some of the driest they've seen in the last 100 years. So it was just a sheer factor that without rain you don't get grass growth, and without grass you can't feed cattle. So they just had to make that second cut, and that was probably the more dramatic one. That really ate into our breeding stocks, and as a result, when everyone went to rebuild and it rained again in February 2020, there was nothing. Well, there were cattle available, but the supplies just were not there to meet the demand.
So we have, to a lesser extent, Canada has had a similar sort of rotation. As far as 2021 was incredibly dry out west. Really, years before that and years since, we've still had a lot of drought. The Canada and U.S. systems, of course, are fully integrated. A lot of the cattle that are born in Canada end up being either fed or processed in the U.S. And so we've seen certainly not nearly as dramatic a pullback, but certainly that trend line has been down of our cow herd. Cattle are, you can't just create, they're not like sheep, which we're going to talk about later. But you can't make a whole bunch of new calves just overnight. So what has that rebuild looked like?
Yeah, it's been an interesting one. I mean, there was a sort of not a panic, but a situation where, because of the really low numbers, cattle producers were trying to find anything they could to actually put back onto their grass. There's nothing more frustrated than a cattle producer that sees grass growing and no cattle eating it. They're losing the ability to generate income. So we saw the Australian producer search far and wide to try and stock the land that they had, which did mean we ended up with different type of cattle in different areas and different production systems. So there was probably a little bit more of a trading atmosphere, people finding cattle from somewhere, and some of them were on the other side of the country, so they were travelling 2,800 miles to get to where they needed to. And then just fattening them and selling them off again, and then doing that sort of buy, sell, repeat process a couple of times. And because we were fortunate, we had probably 2 years of strong price growth, and then we've had another year after that where the prices have remained pretty good. So they've been able to trade their way through it. But it does make it an interesting conversation and decision for that producer, because once you get into that frame of mind, do you then go back into a breeding program if you're a breeder? Or do you stay in that trading program? Because there's going to be a cash flow implication when you step out of that trading situation and go back into breeding one and buy that heifer, and you've got to wait for that heifer to mature and then join and then get the progeny out of it.
So, and it was one of the questions that I had yesterday as well, is that, the market is certainly signaling that, there's money to be made in cattle, which means hold back your heifers. But when your heifer's worth a lot, it's hard to make that call. So how do you make that balance of, that cash flow versus holding back?
It's a very difficult one, and obviously every business is in its own individual situation in terms of the pressures that they've got in it. Probably from where I sit, though, and in hindsight, looking at that Australian market, you can do all the calculations, and depending on what time frames you pick and where the prices are at the time, some get favour over the others in terms of, different decisions. But longer term, I suppose, is probably where you need to put your mind and just say, well, okay, over the next 5 or 10 years, what do I need to be doing? Because when you start stretching it out over that time, it's not a huge amount of difference. And trying to pick price rises and sell at the right time and make the most of what prices are now, potentially costs you in a couple of years down the track. And we found that in Australia was, while the prices were going up, it was great. But in 2023, the market hit the panic button and prices collapsed by about 80% in a couple of months. So it was a huge drop. And if you just bought cattle and then sold into that much lower market, that's a loss, which is unfortunate. But we did find, now that we've got our stocks back up again, and because there are volumes of cattle available, the good quality ones are the ones that will still get the interest and the demand. Those that have sort of played around and tried to buy bits and pieces here and there, they're the ones that are being discounted when you go to the sale.
Sounds like the sheep market in Canada. Anyway, just putting it out there. So, I mean, it is a question of the time that it takes to rebuild. Have there been government programs or support for producers to do this, or is it strictly market driven?
Yeah, it's all market driven, and we were originally thinking that it was going to take a long time. With the lack of cattle that we had and that increased trading activity, we thought the breeding numbers are going to take time to build up. But it's strange how the cattle industry and the sheep industry work in terms of the recovery process is relatively quick, and we've gone from being our lowest cattle inventory in 2019, and while we're not at our highest now, we are at our sort of equal record highest in terms of production volumes. So in the space of 4 years, you can turn it around pretty quickly.
And where does Australian beef end up?
All over the place, but Australia is very heavily reliant on export markets. We've got only a small population of 27 odd million people, so we don't consume enough to consider there's a big market. So 75% of our beef goes overseas. At the moment, the US is our biggest export market, but it comes and goes. As there is the contraction in production here, that provides opportunity for Australian supply into this market. But we saw a couple of years ago when there were large volumes here, the US was a much smaller player in our market. So, but it's similar markets to what the US does, with Japan, South Korea, and China as being our other 3 major markets.
You should be thankful you don't share a border with the US right now. Just kidding, we love you. Okay. All right, Angus, thank you so much for joining me here.
Not a problem. Good to speak.